Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to MnDOT's District 7 Freight Plan online public meeting. My name is Andrew Drusko, and I am the Statewide Freight Planning Director with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Today, we're here to present a short presentation on the development of a regional freight plan for the South Central area in Minnesota. This effort has been very important to connecting potential freight improvements on the public transportation system and tying potential opportunities to the Minnesota Highway Freight Program, as well as discussing key freight needs and issues. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to speak a bit about what we learned over the past 13 months to craft this draft plan. We've worked with a variety of different freight stakeholders and local businesses, and we hope that this effort will really help develop future connections with MnDOT's freight leaders and others in the South Central region. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric Oberhart, who is a leader with this effort from CPCS Transcom, Inc.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. All right. Before we begin, I just want to let folks know that there are a lot of corresponding materials online and available for this project. Recently, we put up an online feedback form, which will be open until March 22nd. You can find that feedback form at district7freightplan.com. And if you go to that website, you'll also be able to see draft versions of the plan document, as well as links to other MnDOT plans and materials. So if you're interested in learning more about some of the things I'll talk about over the course of the next 20 minutes, I highly encourage you to take a look at the website here. You can also enter District 7 Freight Plan on Google, and you'll see a link for a MnDOT website as well, with additional information on the plan and links there too. So for tonight's presentation, what we'd like to do is provide a high-level overview of what the District 7 Freight Plan is, how it relates to some of MnDOT's other work, some of the freight system needs, issues, and challenges identified in the district, and then also some recommendations and opportunities for MnDOT to improve the freight transportation system in the future. So what is the purpose of the District 7 Freight Plan? MnDOT has been developing freight transportation plans for each of its 8 districts, and the goal of these plans and the District 7 Freight Plan is to provide MnDOT with a clear understanding of the multimodal freight transportation system assets in the district, how local industries and businesses use this freight transportation system, and the needs and issues of these businesses and industries. And the goal is that by identifying this information, MnDOT will be able to make well-informed policy and programming decisions in the district in the future. So some of the specific elements that the District 7 Freight Plan provides includes an up-to-date assessment of freight transportation issues and needs that are specific to the district, a list of strategies to improve freight transportation mobility, safety, and infrastructure condition in the region. And finally, this plan will also provide information and data for inclusion in the next Minnesota statewide freight system plan. It's also important to talk about how this plan fits into some of MnDOT's other work. In particular, the District 7 Freight Transportation Plan reflects freight transportation vision and goals that were established in the Minnesota statewide freight system and investment plan. And we'll be talking a little bit more about what some of those goals are when we get to the recommendations portion of this presentation. The Freight Transportation Plan for District 7 also reflects the broader transportation goals and priorities that are established in the Minnesota GO series of transportation plans. It's also important to note that District 7's freight plan will contribute to future state freight plan updates. So the information here is important not only for District 7, but for Minnesota as a whole. So what is District 7's freight system? This is a multimodal freight transportation plan. So this looks at multiple modes of transportation, including the district's road network, railroad network, pipelines, and airports. Particular attention is paid to the road and railroad network, with the most focus on the road network, as this is the area where MnDOT and its planning partners have the greatest opportunity to make investments and changes in the future. It's also important to consider why freight transportation is important for District 7 and Minnesota as a whole. And for District 7, freight transportation is a critical service for many elements of the economy. In particular, about 37% of District 7's employment is associated with freight-related industries or industries that rely heavily on the freight transportation system to support their everyday operations. And about 39% of the district's gross domestic product is associated with those freight-related industries. So a very important economic component for the district and for Minnesota as a whole. It's also important to note that the freight transportation system and freight issues and needs are relevant to all of District 7 and communities across the district. This is not relevant to just select areas of the district. And to illustrate this idea, I've shared two maps here. The map on the left shows the coverage of corn and soybean crops across District 7. And the map on the right shows the distribution of employment and business establishments in the manufacturing sector. And what these serve to illustrate is the fact that freight-related activity occurs across District 7 in a variety of communities and a variety of locations. And this freight transportation system is a critical asset to serve industries such as these. So what are some of the issues, needs, and challenges for District 7's freight transportation system? First, a little bit of information here about the planning process. Much of this planning process was focused on collecting information on issues and needs in the district, and sources of information were many and varied. In particular, we received feedback and guidance from an advisory committee and technical team assembled for the project. We also collected feedback through stakeholder consultations with industry and planning partners across the district. We also conducted an online interactive survey that was open to the public during last summer. We've also conducted analysis of data provided by MnDOT. And finally, we also looked at previous studies and plans relevant to freight transportation and transportation more generally in the district. And so through these 5 different sources of information, we've pulled together some common themes for issues and needs in District 7. And so what I have here are a couple of slides about road-related needs and issues and trucking-related needs and issues, and then an additional slide about railroad issues and needs as well. So in regards to the road network, we've broken this down into categories of safety, mobility, and condition. In regards to truck safety, common theme in the district has been the need to continue improving intersection safety for trucks. This was a common theme for feedback from industry stakeholders as well as the public, as well as a need identified through some analysis of MnDOT data as well. The idea here is that trucks are often slower to turn, stop, and accelerate relative to fast-moving traffic on trunk highways. And so improving intersection safety through the implementation of things such as traffic signals, roundabouts, acceleration and deceleration lanes, and other improvements can help improve safety for trucks as they navigate intersections. Another major area for feedback was the need for potential 4-lane expansions on some trunk highways in the district. And this is an area where we've seen some investment in the past and some additional investment upcoming in the future, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Another opportunity for truck safety improvement was identified through Minnesota's Weight Safety Enforcement Plan, which identified opportunities to improve some truck weight enforcement facilities in the district as well. In regards to truck mobility, or the efficiency and ease of which trucks can move through the district, there were many points of feedback and findings. A common point of feedback from industry was the topic of roundabout design and ensuring that MnDOT continues to design roundabouts appropriately to safely accommodate the movements of trucks through them. Another common piece of feedback from the public, as well as planning stakeholders throughout the district and some statewide planning documents, was the need for additional truck parking in the district, particularly in areas around Mankato, as well as some areas around Trunk Highway 60. Another common point of feedback for truck mobility was an ongoing truck driver shortage, which is not unique to District 7. It's not unique to Minnesota, and it's really not unique to any state in the United States. This is a common challenge faced by many communities across the US, but it was commonly mentioned in District 7 as a potential impediment to truck mobility because a lack of drivers can affect the reliability of truck transportation services. Some other truck mobility issues and needs that were noted, differences in truck size and weight regulations between Minnesota, Iowa, and South Dakota, which can affect the loading level of trucks traveling between the two states and the efficiency of truck movements between the two states. We also heard feedback in regards to the need for truck parking that can accommodate oversized, overweight truck loads, such as wind turbine components, and also the potential need to investigate clearance for very, very large loads under bridges on I-90. One other point of feedback we received on truck mobility is the topic of snow removal on trunk highways and the ability to receive timely information about snow cover so that truck operators can safely plan their operations. Final category was road condition and pavement condition. And generally, we found that this was not an issue on the trunk highway network. That is to say, trunk highway pavements and bridges were generally in good condition. However, there were areas on county and local roads that could require additional investment in the future. In regards to railroad related needs and issues, we also identified a smaller set of issues and needs in the district. In regards to railroad safety, District 7 has a relatively high count of crashes at passively protected grade crossings when compared to other districts. These are grade crossings that are only protected by stop signs and not protected by gates, lights, bells, and other active devices. So this is a potential area for improvement in the future. On the topic of rail mobility, a common theme that we heard from shippers was a desire for more access or easier access to intermodal container shipping, either in the district or near the district in areas such as the Twin Cities. And another topic that we heard from some folks was in regards to rail mobilities and the consolidation of grain elevators. The idea here being that as some grain elevators are combined or consolidated on certain rail lines to create larger volumes of cars in select areas, the consolidation of these grain elevators means that there might be longer truck trips as local elevators are closed to consolidate for larger elevators. Finally, in the topic of rail condition, some stakeholders noted the need for continued investment in short line railroads, as some of the investments needed to bring smaller railroads up to new modern standards for heavier cars and faster speeds require very large amounts of capital spending, and this sometimes is beyond the capacity of some of these small railroads. So, but they are important economic development assets, so considering to support them in the future is a potential way to support the economy of the state as well. So what are the ways that MnDOT can make improvements for the freight transportation system in the future? What are the opportunities? We have grouped our recommendations into a number of categories here. We grouped them to reflect some of the types of tools that MnDOT and its partners have to make improvements to the freight system. So there's policies which govern how MnDOT will work on and act on certain freight related topics and infrastructure related topics. There's also partnerships or the collaboration with other groups in the district to address certain freight needs and issues. There are programs which are investments of time or money on specific topics. And finally, there are projects or very specific infrastructure projects to address specific issues or needs. We've also organized the freight plan's goals around the original set of goals presented in the statewide freight system plan. And so these goals relate to the support for the economy, support for Minnesota's mobility, infrastructure condition, transportation safety, and environment and communities. And we'll talk about each of these individually here in a moment. One other thing to note is that multiple groups within MnDOT and within the state have a role in supporting and implementing some of the freight plan recommendations you'll see on previous slides. So these include MnDOT District 7, the individual district staff that focus on transportation topics just in South Central Minnesota. It also includes MnDOT's central office, including the Office of Freight and Commercial Vehicle Operations. And it also includes the Minnesota Freight Advisory Committee, cooperative partnership between MnDOT and private industry to understand and solve freight transportation issues and needs across the state. So what we'll do here is I'll briefly walk through some of the goal areas. I'm not going to read through each of the recommendations individually, but if you do have questions at the end of the presentation, feel free to ask them. And also keep in mind that the information about these individual recommendations is available on the website we shared earlier, which we'll also share at the end of the presentation as well. So the statewide freight system plan has a goal to support Minnesota's economy, and it has a couple of sub-goals related to this. The freight transportation system should operate efficiently. It should provide Minnesota shippers with connections to the rest of the state, nation, and the world. And the freight transportation system should allow Minnesota's businesses to respond and adjust to changing economic conditions. In terms of support for Minnesota's economy, there's a couple of significant opportunities here. First, this freight transportation plan has generated a large amount of information on specific freight issues and needs in the district. And so moving forward in the future, MnDOT can incorporate this information on issues and needs into its existing planning processes and then into existing or future projects as a way to continually address certain freight issues and needs in the future. Another major opportunity here is for MnDOT to continue its outreach to freight stakeholders to understand how freight issues and needs change, arise, and just kind of morph over time, depending on the economy of the state and the economy of the world. The second goal area is related to freight transportation mobility, and the statewide freight system plan has two goals in this area. First, the freight transportation system should provide access for all freight users. And second, the freight system should be operated reliably with minimal choke points, congestion, or bottlenecks. Some particular opportunities here include the opportunity to continue engagement with Iowa and South Dakota DOTs and other government agencies to understand cross-border freight transportation issues and needs, and also issues and needs at a local level. Another major policy opportunity here is continuing to study and document truck size and weight issues that arise from different weight limits between different states, and what those differences mean for economic competitiveness and choice of transportation modes in District 7 and Minnesota as a whole. Finally, a program opportunity here, again, is to continue to study potential freight mobility improvements using the issues and needs identified in this plan, and then incorporating those improvements into future projects. The third area is related to transportation system condition, with the goal of preserving Minnesota's infrastructure. There's two sub-goals in this area. MnDOT should ensure that critical segments and connections are available to shippers, and also ensure that these freight-related segments and conditions are in a good state of repair. Notable opportunities here include support for expanding truck parking options and opportunities in the district, and continuing support for short line rail capital investments to support those smaller rail lines in the district. Also, there's a notable policy opportunity in this area for MnDOT to continue prioritizing maintenance of existing infrastructure over the construction of new infrastructure. And the idea here is MnDOT already is responsible for a very substantial number of assets across the state. And so maintenance of existing assets should take precedence over the creation of new assets in general. In regards to the safety goal area, the statewide freight system plan has two goals. MnDOT should seek to enhance freight system safety, and MnDOT should also ensure that plans are in place to protect areas where freight activity and the public are operating in the same area. Notable opportunities in this area, in particular, as we mentioned some of these before, there are a lot of documented freight safety issues and needs as part of this plan, and MnDOT can continue to address these issues and needs through targeted investments in its existing work, as well as through applying for freight-related funding programs in the future, such as the Minnesota Highway Freight Program. Another opportunity in this area is also partnering with local communities and railroads to understand and advance grade crossing improvements in the future as well. Final category is environment and community, with the goal of protecting Minnesota's environment and communities. And there's two kind of sub goals in this area. First, the infrastructure and freight operations of the state should respect and complement natural, cultural, and social context. And also, freight transportation system operations and infrastructure should be consistent with the principles of context-sensitive solutions. Particularly important policy recommendation in this area that we've heard from a number of folks in the district is the need for MnDOT to continue to balance the needs of freight users and other transportation users when working on projects or trunk highway projects through town centers, and ensuring that both groups are at the table represented and considered when investments are being made. There's also a partnership opportunity here, and that is ensuring that the information created as part of this freight planning work is available to local planners at the county and city and town level as well, so that they can also be aware of freight issues and needs in their own communities and work to solve these through some of their own work as well. So one category that we haven't really talked about much is projects, and this is an area where District 7 and its planning partners have been making improvements throughout the past and will continue to do in the future. Some examples of previous or ongoing work for freight relevant improvements in the district include the upcoming US 14 4-lane expansion, as well as the previous Minnesota Highway 60 4-lane expansion as well. Also, as part of this freight transportation planning work, District 7 has been exploring some potential solutions for other high-ranking issues and needs in the district to get a better understanding of the level of complexity, level of effort, and level of investment needed to solve some common types of freight transportation issues and needs in the district. What you see here on this slide are two examples of some of the ideas being studied. For example, the level of effort to improve certain types of highway ramps on I-90, or the level of effort and investment required to improve certain types of rural intersections as well. So that concludes the majority of my presentation for today. Before we go over to questions, I just wanted to note again that the online feedback form for this project will be open until March 22nd, and you can find this at district7freightplan.com. And so this again is a great opportunity to read through the draft plan, read through the recommendations, and read through some of the other draft project materials if this is a topic you're very interested in. This is also a well-structured and easy opportunity to provide feedback because there's an interactive comment form on the website. So if you do want to provide some additional comments after you've read some more, feel free to do so through the website. Also, I'd like to note some potential points of contact that are listed on the MnDOT District 7 Freight Plan website. Andrew Andrusko, who did the introduction earlier, is available at the email listed here, and two of the district's planning staff are listed here as well.